Chapter 9. Caden. Lane had called Scott and told him the plans, arranged for him to stay the night, and Lane and I would meet him after we'd closed the shop. Scott was more than happy to stay with Amy, especially since he realized that Lane wouldn't be disappointed about their date night. Just as we were closing up and all the shipments were late and coming in at the last minute, someone had to stay. I glanced over at Lane and I knew it had to be me, until Brian opened the rear door like a breath of fresh air to save the night. When Brian strolled into the storeroom, Gray had been calling me, and I fished my phone out of my pocket and strolled to the front for privacy. "I'm at the hotel, baby." "I'm heading out to your home, Gray," I said, knowing Brian would stay and help out. He'd saved us from breaking our word to Scott, and I wanted some time with Amy. Furthermore, Lane and I had planned to stop off and get a late-night snack for Scott, who was partial to junk food, and something to eat for me and Lane, plus bring over a bottle of wine Lane had saved for this occasion, a candlelight dinner. "Soon it will be our place," Gray interrupted my thoughts with his good news. I smiled, my heart happy at the sound of his words, and then it occurred to me, what the fuck was I going to do with that new apartment? If I kept it, I would have a 6-month lease, and I had an obligation to fulfill. "I don't like to throw away money," I sighed softly. Maybe I could get someone to sublease the apartment, but who? Sean came to mind, but then I'd have to deal with him, and I couldn't bring myself to bring him back into my life the way he'd behaved with Gray. I didn't want anyone to interfere with my relationship again, and I was tired of playing games. I was too busy trying to figure out what to do with my apartment, and didn't hear all the conversation with Gray. I thought he was trying to include me in on his business, and I was trying to work out some business of my own. I caught the latter part of his conversation about food. I know I shouldn't eat late at night, but I had to get something into my stomach before the kitchen closed. The waiter is delivering the food now, and he's at the door. Because of hotel and kitchen rules, he can't come inside the room, so he hands me the bag and I have to set up everything myself. "I'll call back and check with you after I've eaten." We disconnected our call, and for some reason I felt lonely. Something I'd never felt before. I glanced up and Brian had sat in a chair near me. "What's wrong, Brian? You're not your happy, cheerful self tonight," I observed. "I couldn't find him," he said, and slumped forward as if defeated. "Who?" I said, forgetting our previous conversation. "Valentine. The boy I told you about." Everything had escaped my mind with the amount of work and thinking about Grayle, and whether I was truly rid of Austin. Gray had said he was through with Austin, and then there was a baby. I'd shuddered to think what could happen next, a long-lost lover, or husband Austin had forgotten about. With Austin, it could be anything. "I remember Brian. He's the cute dude you met at a truck stop on your drive here to Nevermore." Brian lowered his head and clasped his hands together, bit his bottom lip and shook his head up and down. I didn't want him to think I wasn't concerned about his life or engaged in the conversation, when he'd been invested in my life to the point that he wanted me to succeed and had done everything possible to bring that about. Brian had said in passing when we were in the storeroom labeling bags of coffee and containers of tea that he enjoyed what he was doing and seeing the people he helped get their business going, and when they succeeded, this brought him the greatest pleasure. He'd said it was therapy for him to work here. But he deserved someone to be there when he needed them, and so I was waiting to hear his story, and perhaps offer some advice such as I had been able to give. It had been said that a drowning man would grasp at a straw, and I was that straw. I called the bus station, and they wouldn't give me any information, only to say that they did have a Valentine who'd purchased a ticket in Los Angeles going east, but since I didn't know his last name, they couldn't tell me anything. Even if you did have his last name, they weren't going to give you any information on him. "Come over to the computer, and I'll Google him." I stood, and Brian followed suit. He rose from the chair with a different expression. A smile of hope was my interpretation. I hit him on the shoulder. Maybe you can find out his last name and there could be a picture of him. You could say he's missing and have an ad or billboard made. The mayor said that if I wanted to rent a billboard on the highway and in town for my business, that it wouldn't cost much. You can use the one he offered me. I hadn't thought about that. It's a good idea, Brian agreed. I sat at my desk, and Brian sat quietly alongside me as I turned on my computer. I placed Valentine's name in, and there were pictures everywhere of a Valentine posing as a model. I turned the screen where Brian could see him. "Is this your boy?" A wide smile crossed his face and he turned to me and said, "That's him. It says here that he was a child star and a model in his teenage years. He looked different." "That's because he's a man now." "No. It's not that. Look at that later picture. He's happy and carefree driving that expensive car, and the one where he's advertising that underwear. He's about the same age, but he looked like he didn't have a dime. And here it said that he was rich. The boy or man I saw begging for cigarettes and a light didn't have a cent. I offered to give him some money and a ride, and he turned me down. He said he wasn't looking for a man or a handout, even though he was at a truck stop." I turned to Brian. "And were you looking for someone?" "No. I had just broken up with my husband, and I couldn't get hard if I wanted. I was devastated, but it was something about him that made me want to take care of him. The boy's eyes are as clear as the time I saw him. I couldn't forget those eyes. They spoke to me, and I didn't realize it until I'd driven away what he was saying, without words. You know when you've seen someone and they have that sad look in their eyes that says, 'Rescue me.' If I had, I didn't recognize it because I guessed I wasn't old enough and didn't have enough experience, and I had great parents who picked me up every time I fell. I'd gone to a rescue shelter looking for a puppy one day, and ran across one that had been abused. He had sad eyes like Brian said about Valentine. I begged my mother to get it for me, and she did, but he didn't live very long. I was devastated." I glanced over at Brian, who had fixated on the pictures of Valentine. I knew I'd seen that face and especially his eyes before, but I didn't want to get Brian's hopes up. I let it go because Lane stepped in and motioned to me by pointing at his watch that we should be heading out. After giving Brian instructions about what had to be cataloged and information to put into QuickBooks, which I was sure he didn't hear, so I jotted it down and pushed the paper in front of the computer where he could see it. Lane grabbed me by my shirt and pulled me out, and we headed to the drive-thru of the fast food place to get Scott something. While we waited, Lane said, "What the fuck was that about?" "I was trying to help Brian find that guy he met at the truck stop." "Don't you know you're inviting trouble? He's focused now. He works hard when he's not fucking around. We can't just use him. He needs a love life like you or me," I added. "When that happens, we won't have a life. We need more people to keep up the pace of this shop. Who's going to work for free the way Brian has? Someone who needs a paycheck. We're making enough money now. All we're doing is making money. We can afford to pay someone for all the work Brian is doing. I'm going to give him a partnership in the place. Like that he won't leave. I'm not against that, but he doesn't need the money. He's in search of someone, and we can't control what he will do once he finds that someone. He'll just up and leave us and own part of the business," Lane said. "Not if we hire that special someone he's searching for," I said. "And how the fuck are we going to do that?" "Place an ad in the papers, place his picture on a billboard that says, 'Have you seen this guy?'" "And what if we're sued for this?" Lane inquired. "I'm going to marry a lawyer, so sue us," I chuckled. "In all seriousness, the guy Brian is looking for is probably homeless and will never see the ad, but we have to try for his sake. Why am I not surprised that he'd pick up a homeless dude? That's what he's been chasing all his life, and then when they get what they want and walk away from him. Even that husband of his did the same thing." He had nothing when Brian came across him at some club. He knew that Brian was a born philanderer when he met him, and now he's acting as if that was a surprise. He closed his eyes to Brian fooling around with boy after boy, taking them to Las Vegas, buying them sports cars. His husband let him go on, even when he knew about him fucking around until he wanted out, and that's when he asked Brian to leave. Do you believe he asked him to leave his own home and brought in a pair of vicious-looking dogs to keep Brian away, after taking half his assets? I think he's learned his lesson, and this guy is our age, I answered in Brian's defense. I had a special place in my heart for him, and I knew Lane did too, but he couldn't excuse the running around with different men the way Brian was known to have done, and still was doing. Really? That is the age of all of these boys. 20-something, wide-eyed, and looking to separate Brian from his money. But if Brian wants to give his money away, it's his. He's worked for it. I think he likes taking care of young men, I added. Yeah. He thought you wanted a daddy too, before you explained to him that he was just a fake boyfriend. Brian is too gullible for a man his age. And how would you know? We are all susceptible when we meet that man who we can't forget. That's what happens at any age. Look at us. And I drove up and gathered my greasy paper bags filled with fries, burgers, and drinks. Then I paid for the food and drove away to Gray's home.